on the other hand, by compliance contrary to their principles, using a variety of evasions to avoid complying, and modes of disguising the compliance when it became unavoidable. This is going to be interesting. You'll see what culminates in a very funny little bit about fire engines here. So they used a variety of evasions to avoid complying, and they used modes of disguising the compliance when it became unavoidable. Quote, the common mode at last was to grant money under the phrase of its being for the king's use, and never to inquire how it was applied. So they said, we can't give money for war, we can't have anything to do with war, not even defensive war. They believe defensive war is evil and should be not done. So when the king asks for money for war purposes, they just say, here's for the king's use, we're not interested. Here's for the king. Quote, but if the demand was not directly from the crown, that phrase was found not so proper, and some other was to be invented. Thus, when powder was wanted, I think it was for the garrison at Louisburg, and the government at New England solicited a grant of some from Pennsylvania, which was much urged on the House by Governor Thomas, they would not grant money to buy powder, because that is an ingredient of war. But they voted an aid to New England of £3,000 to be put into the hand of the governor. So here's money to give to him specifically, quote, and appropriated it for the purchase of bread, flour, wheat, or other grains, end quote. That's other grains. That's what the Quakers said. Here, use this money. Gave it to the governor and said, bread, flour, wheat, or other grains. Now, grain was a word for gunpowder. Quote, some of the council, desirous of giving the House still further embarrassment, so they were like, you knuckleheads, come on. They advised the governor not to accept that provision as not being the thing he had demanded. He was like, they were like, you asked for powder and they gave you money to buy grain. Send it back. But the governor replied, quote, I shall take the money, for I understand very well their meaning, other grain, is gunpowder, which he accordingly bought, and they never objected to it. It was an allusion to this fact that when in our fire company we feared the success of our proposal in favor of the lottery, and I had said to a friend of mine, one of our members, if we fail, let us move the purchase of a fire engine with the money. So, in other words, they're going to use this money to do a lottery to build a cannonade and so on down on the waterfront for the defense of the town. And he says, now, you know what? If this doesn't happen, if we can't do this self-defense bit and it gets voted down, let's buy a fire engine. You know, a fire engine is those things that pump, you had a thing to pump water, a big cask for water and stuff. Let's buy a fire engine with the money, says Franklin. The Quakers can have no objection to that. And then, if you nominate me, and I owe you as a committee for that purpose, we will buy a great gun, which is certainly a fire engine, says Franklin. I see, said he. You have improved by being so long in the assembly. Your equivocal project would be just a match for their wheat or other grains. So you wonder if they would even object, the Quakers. Oh, you know, we approved for the purchase of a fire engine. A fire engine was purchased. It's on the waterfront protecting us and we don't object. You know, you wonder if they would object. Those embarrassments that the Quakers suffered from having established and published it as one of their principles, that no kind of war was lawful, and which, being once published, they could not afterwards, however they might change their minds, easily get rid of. This reminds me of what I think a more prudent conduct in another sect among us, that of the Dunkers. I was acquainted with one of its founder, Michael Weffer, soon after it appeared. Now he goes on to talk about how this guy who started this sect, he tells Ben, people say the weirdest things about us. We don't want to tell everybody our public revelation. Because our our revelation keeps changing. God keeps speaking to us. And we keep realizing we haven't totally understood everything. So we don't want to set it all down, because once people set it all down in books and documents and stuff, historically that's a disaster, because then, you know, God can tell them they got something wrong, and you have to be able to change that. So this is weird sounding religion, but they didn't want to set down their basic beliefs, and so they had all kinds of rumors about their beliefs circulating amongst other, you know, groups and stuff. He says, quote, "Now we are not sure that we are arrived at the end of this progression of ideas and at the perfection of spiritual or theological knowledge. And we fear that if we should once print our confession of faith, we should feel ourselves as if bound and confined by it. Perhaps we will be unwilling to receive further improvement." So if we set ourselves down on a concrete document here, and God keeps talking to us, we might not be willing to listen to Him. Quote, "And our successors still more so, as conceiving what their elders and founders had done to be something sacred, never to be departed from." End quote. So that's why he doesn't want to print their sayings, and he's telling Ben this is a disaster because everyone's saying so many weird things about us that aren't true, but yet we don't want to publicly say our thing. This modesty in a sect is perhaps a single instance in the history of mankind, says Ben Franklin. That's his opinion. Single instance in the history of mankind is a religious sect that said, we might change our mind, so we don't want to lay it all down. So this modesty is perhaps a single instance in the history of mankind, every other sect supposing itself in possession of all truth, and that those who differ are so far in the wrong, like a man traveling in foggy weather. Now he gives us a great little thing. You got a man in the fog, and he looks around him, and those who are near him are clear, but people further out he sees, he's like, you people are lost. And this is the same for everybody. That's Ben Franklin's little analogy. In order of time, I should have mentioned before that, having in 1742 invented an open stove for the better warming of rooms, and at the same time saving fuel as the fresh air was warmed in entering, I made it a present of the model to Mr. Robert Grace, one of my early friends, who, having an iron furnace, found the casting of the plates for these stoves a profitable thing. It's good for everybody, as they were growing in demand. So he's always looking for new business things to make with iron, shoes, horseshoes or whatever, and big old plates that you then rivet together into a stove, the Franklin stove. That's amazing. Now, you couldn't have done this earlier. They just had to have fireplaces earlier because they couldn't afford iron. They weren't productive enough to afford iron. But the richer people get, the more common iron is in a semi-free society, at least. Now, it's still known as the Franklin stove. So, just to mention, in case that's not known to you, he talks about this. It's just the stove made of metal that sits out in the middle of the room. People just couldn't afford it. Someone had to invent it at some point. You know, it's obvious that that's going to put out more heat than if you just had it in the brick chimney at the end of the room. And it saves, as he said, it saves wood. So he mentions how it saves a lot of people a lot of extra labor by saving on wood. Continuing. He made a present to this gentleman, one of his early friends, who found this profitable to make them. To promote that demand, I wrote and published a pamphlet. So his friend makes these furnaces, and he writes an educational pamphlet, quote, entitled An Account of the New Invented Pennsylvanian Fireplaces, wherein their construction and manner of operation are particularly explained, their advantages above every other method of warming rooms demonstrated, and all objections that have been raised against the use of them answered and obviated. End quote. This pamphlet had a good effect. Governor Thomas was so pleased with the construction of this new stove, as described in it, that he offered to give me a patent